Let's take a step away from gameplay and talk about the story. As you can probably imagine, I am mostly positive about this aspect of the game as well, although not nearly as much as I am with the gameplay. It's not that I have more to criticize, it's that I just don't have as much to gush about. The things I like the most about it, that being the setting, atmosphere, and environmental gags, serve the gameplay just as much as they do the story. Other than this, the characters are fine, the voice acting is fine, and the overall narrative is, as you can imagine, fine. That's not to say that it doesn't have some hard-hitting moments though. The overall themes are pretty existential, and I've seen a lot of people overanalyzing things like you would expect from any game with the word souls in the genre. Where this game succeeds is that it doesn't need to be overly ambiguous about its world in order to make it feel real or believable, which is mostly due to how it handles topics such as pollution and how it has affected this fictional society run almost entirely by crabs. The tone of this game is a little difficult to parse for those same reasons. The first half of the game is pretty lighthearted, with the vibrant colors and use of euphemisms in favor of profanity leading me to believe that it was targeted towards a younger audience. But this gradually changes the further you get. Looking at it now, it's more comparable to other creators waiting until they get past YouTube's obligatory no swearing time frame, before putting their sailor cap on and schooling you in all 13 sentence enhancers. That's to say, I unironically think they did this to troll the ESRB into giving them a lower rating, and the funny thing about that is that it worked. There are a few moments where the game drops the censorship altogether, and at least one moment near the end where they don't, but arguably should have given how ridiculous it sounds. The game does a fine job of broaching serious topics, but at the risk of sounding a little self-important, I think that a lot of people are reading way deeper into the story than the writers actually intended. The main character is depressed, but I do not see this as a commentary on depression, just like how the game handles pollution, but it doesn't come off as a lecture about the importance of recycling and keeping our oceans clean.
Dang it, Bobby! Have you been dumping propane tanks in the ocean again?
As a quick side note, the studio joined the Games for Waves initiative over the summer and donated 20% of the proceeds to the UK's Whale and Dolphin Convention. This ended up totaling in over $40,000, and I would be remiss not to mention this. I always like seeing studios put their money where their mouth is. I don't mean to imply that the game has nothing to say. These are ever-present topics throughout the game and are a crucial part of its world and story. Any statement it tries to make is reinforced through the world and level design, instead of repeatedly hitting you over the head with it long after you've already gotten the point. As for the characters themselves, the only one I really want to focus on right now is the protagonist, Krill. Like I mentioned earlier, he's an antisocial hermit crab who sounds like a cross between Ash Ketchum and Milhouse, and is struggling to navigate these unfamiliar waters, both physically through gameplay and emotionally through dialogue and story sequences. Prior to having his shell stolen, he was living a blissfully sheltered life in the relative safety of his tide pools, so it's understandable that he would be a little broody after being forced to leave his home and witness just how bad life is for everybody else. I hope you like New Zealand, welcome to Memphis. Whereas a lesser story would use this to make the main character either cynical or nihilistic, or annoyingly optimistic, I feel like Krill's response to this is far more realistic. He's moody and frustrated, but he still wants to help the people around him while trying not to get so involved that it detracts him from his main goal: find his shell, get it back, and then go home. He's neither uncaring nor altruistic, and this is where many of the details that I like about Krill start to shine through. He tries to do the right thing, but frequently ends up making things worse. His self-centered goals are called into question time and again by the people who live here and aren't privileged enough to simply turn a blind eye to their neighbors' suffering. And the fact that Krill does care is what drives much of the emotional side of this story. But it's not all doom and gloom either. We do get to see moments where Krill seems genuinely happy, or at the very least, that he's enjoying his adventure and has found a sense of purpose. These moments are usually short-lived as he's reintroduced into the ugliness of this world, but the brief moment of optimism feels very genuine in a way that most games don't. Despite being a game about crabs, this is a very human story that can punch surprisingly far above its weight in ways that you wouldn't expect. So it's no wonder that people have taken to overanalyzing the smallest details in the story, and why I think that they're right to do so. There's a surprising amount to dig into when it comes to this story and its characters, and I can't help but appreciate seeing a community so passionate about this game that they're willing to take a microscope to its world and characters. So, with all that said, let's get into it. The game begins with a broadcast from a fictional documentary association that is also a reference to the studio's previous game, Going Under. The narrator tries to probe your outlook on the world. Is it beautiful, or is it evil and corrupt? They themselves settle on the idea that the world is resilient, before drawing the focus towards our main character, Krill, resting in his shell. He's approached by a loan shark, which is just somebody controlling one of those grabber toys with a shark head on them. To summarize, the surrounding area has been annexed and is now a duchy called Slacktide, and Krill, unbeknownst to him, has been committing tax evasion. Krill doesn't really know what any of this means, even after having it explained to him, but the shark says that he has to pay up or his shell will be repoed. You're directed to a nearby stash of heart kelp, which you may recall is this game's healing item. The shark laughs at him for this, saying that the ocean has moved on to the trash standard and no longer accepts it as currency. Krill tries to negotiate for more time, which causes the shark to grab him by the shell and throw him out. You catch up to him a little further, and he tells you to get a job and pay up if you want your shell back. You continue to follow him into the ocean, where you're introduced to basic platforming mechanics like swimming and climbing, before getting chased even further by some killer zombie crabs. This leads you to a small cave where you can get Krill's iconic fork and poncho, then fight a few more enemies before finding your first moon snail shell, which is this game's version of bonfires. You bump into the shark again, who says that your shell is now the property of the Duchess, and you'll need to speak to her if you want to try and get it back. You then step into the tutorial zone, the Shallows. This is where the game opens up and gives you a small taste of freedom. You're allowed to explore much of this area with little restraint, and as long as you can contend with the tougher enemies, the only inaccessible zones are those that require the grappling hook, which we don't have yet. It's always stood out to me just how relaxing this first zone is, despite the difficulty it can present on your first playthrough. The area is bright and colorful, and the music is very laid back. Gameplay-wise, it's a lot like Undeadburg from the first Dark Souls, a zone that is difficult on your first run but an absolute cakewalk on your second. Enemies are weak and stagger more easily than in later zones, and they frequently drop heart kelp on death, which will happen less often as the game progresses. The developers knew that the player would likely struggle here on their first run, so they took some extra steps to help smooth out the difficulty. The real challenge comes in the form of the first optional boss of the area, the Royal Shell Splitter. This is where you're introduced to mechanics such as grab attacks, which will kill you instantly at base health, overhead attacks that can damage your shell, and your fear meter, which prevents you from attacking and forces you to hide in your shell when full. Fear is classified as a psychological attack, along with some other debuffs we'll see later, and can be avoided by hiding in your shell, dodging to the side, or simply looking away. If Krill can see it, then it's going to have a much greater impact, which isn't something the game really tells you. If you do die, then you'll learn about the moon jelly mechanic. This allows you to spawn immediately outside the boss arena, although you can opt out and do the trip like in a traditional Souls-like. Considering how many people simply run past all the enemies on their way to the fog door in those games, I see this as a nice quality of life improvement that also allows the fights to be tougher, since you always have the option to respawn right outside and try again. I never felt like the fight was being made worse with the ability to retry immediately, although this does have the effect of causing me to sometimes run past all the enemies in order to start the fight, because I know that I'll respawn with full health and healing if I die. However, given how involved some of these fights are if you're not abusing magic, this was a fair trade-off, and it's only an issue on your second playthrough when you know where the bosses are. But I still feel the need to mention that, to the right person, this is going to be enough for them to dub the entire game Baby's First Souls-like. We're only one step short of a traditional checkpoint system at this point, so it's only fair to acknowledge the other side of the argument, even if I personally view it as a positive. The intended path is for you to proceed forward, find another moon shell, and then proceed to meet with 2 Lobster Knight guards in front of Slacktide. The tryhard guard, as she's called, refuses to let you in because you don't have a shell, although the other guard needs to spell that out because she speaks like a character from Canterbury Tales. You're directed to the east, which lieth a repository laden with complimentary garmentry, aka, go east and meet the guard captain to cover yourself. The area isn't far, and after interacting with a soda machine, you equip a soda can as a shell. Once you go to leave...
Claws off, lawbreaker!
Oh crap, I'm sorry. Was I supposed to grab a ticket?
You think yourself above the law, but the law is not so easily outwitted. By its strength alone do we rise above the beasts.
I'm really sorry. I'll go to the back of the line, okay?
You should be so lucky. I'll have your head like I have these other worthless law breakers.
This is your first real boss fight. Nephro is an introduction to an enemy you'll be fighting many times throughout the game, the Cavalry Lobster. He's also an introduction to another persisting concept, which is that bosses are named after the creature they represent. It's likely that he's meant to be Nephrops norvegicus. How do you pronounce that? It's likely that he's meant to be Nephrops norvegicus, also known as the Norway lobster, the Dublin prawn, or the schlobster, which is a mix of a shrimp and a lobster and also your mom's favorite activity. I love this guy. I love the over-the-top performance from his voice actor, I love how he fights with a lance made of a straw and a plastic lid, and I love how he's just tough enough to pose a good challenge on your first run. If you didn't fight the Royal Shell Splitter, then this is your chance to learn about grab attacks, moon jellies, stagger and capsizing, and all the other stuff that we already went through. Once he's defeated, Krill has a moment of panic as he tries to reassure himself that it was self-defense, which is really entertaining if you happen to kill him with the game's best accessibility option, gun. Understandably, Krill doesn't tell the guards at Slacktide what happened, and they let you in. You're not allowed to wander inside the walls, but you can actually platform to those forbidden areas if you know how, and the guards will have dialogue acknowledging this. It's no secret that I'm a big fan of this kind of attention to detail, so I wanted to include it here. If you progress normally, then you cut to the front of this long line and go to meet the Duchess. Duchess Magista is about what you would expect given what you've heard, especially after the guard at the gate warned you not to talk about the zombie crabs running around in her front yard. She's only willing to cut a deal with Krill after he flatters her enough, tasking him with finding her something shiny for her throne room before she agrees to defer his taxes. She sent a platoon to a cave to the west, but nobody is reported back. Krill decides to mention the murderous crabs anyways, and she promptly dismisses him. You proceed to another part of the castle where an NPC will tell you where to get the grapple hook, which you use to get past the urchins blocking the path to proceed, but not before dodging the game's one and only environmental trap when this giant urchin starts rolling down the stairs. The NPC at the top apologizes and says that Nephro told him to hold it until he gets back. He takes a second to talk about how great of a person the captain is, with a golden smile and the heart of a prankster, just to make it all the more awkward that we killed him earlier. Shortly after proceeding, you find yourself in the cave that the Duchess told you about and are approached by the mysterious moon snail. It somehow already knows about Krill's plight and wants to help, seemingly for no other reason than pity. This is where we first hear of Umami, although it's likely also what Krill thought when he first saw the Duchess. Wait, no, I already made that joke earlier. We're introduced to shell spells and forced to practice them on a training dummy that is immune to physical damage, and told to proceed forward where we will get to meet the mysterious and attractive moon snail in person. This is where the training wheels really come off. The area is small, but there are plenty of tough enemies to fight. Stagger rates are more in line with how they will be throughout the rest of the game, and it can be surprisingly challenging on your first playthrough, especially if you're still getting familiar with the controls and dodge timings. Your shells will also break more quickly if you haven't been leveling your resistance stat, so there are plenty of spares scattered around the area. I struggled in this zone for quite a while on my first run, and the Q-tip wielding crabs would become the bane of my existence until my second playthrough when I finally got the dodge timings down. The area caps off with a surprisingly tough boss fight against what will later become a mini-boss in each zone, albeit with different variants. The Polluted Platoon Pathfinder is your first mandatory introduction to crushing attacks, which will hit you through your shell and deal massive damage to your shell health. This fight is also the best and worst example for an issue I mentioned earlier, attacks that have a much longer wind-up and tracking than you would expect them to. Like I mentioned before, the only real solution is to learn the dodge timings or block them with a high enough resistance stat, but it can feel especially unfair this early in the game. He also has a forward jab attack that doesn't do much damage but has such a subtle telegraph that I saw many people complaining that it's unavoidable on their first playthrough. This isn't necessarily true, but the sentiment says a lot about how cheap it feels, and another boss has an even worse example of this that we'll see later. So I suppose it's a good thing that there's a speedrunning strategy where you platform along the perimeter wall to reach the exit before the fight begins and locks you in the arena, which is how people doing a no-fork playthrough get past this fight. Once you've defeated him, you get a pristine pearl to take back to the Duchess and proceed to the next room to meet the moon snail. This is where you spend umami crystals to purchase skills, and we start by getting the ability to shelleport between the various moon snail shells we've been unlocking. As you can imagine, moon snails are also real creatures, and they look just about like this one here. I thought that they were kind of mesmerizing to look at until I started looking into their behavior, and now I'm convinced that they're an underwater equivalent of the blob. This didn't help me appreciate the ocean, I'm just more scared of it now. We're lucky that this dude is helping Krill instead of drilling a hole into his tin can and sucking his body through it like an imploding submarine. Thankfully, this one's friendly, and he even has a charming character. He speaks in the third person, but only for dramatic effect. There are moments where he gets annoyed and breaks character before correcting himself and going back to the bit. It's a level of charm that many characters in this game have. My only complaint is that he dumps dialogue to you every single time you choose a skill, which can make acquiring them more annoying than they need to be. It fits his character as a long-winded narrator of your adventure, but it can still get a little grating after the 50th page of dialogue. Once you're finished, you warp back to the central shallows, where you can either explore the rest of the area with the grappling hook or return to Slacktide, where something is noticeably off. The music stops, the colors desaturate, and the guard at the front gate complains about how the trash just keeps piling up and he's sick of it, then says that it's all worthless. The same thing those zombie crabs at the very start of the game said before we got our fork. He then attacks us and brings us to our next level, Fort Slacktide. It's not obvious when you first arrive here that this is going to be a level for you to fight through, or at the very least, it wasn't to me. A much smarter person would see all the side routes and climbable paths and probably intuit that this is going to happen, but I was pleasantly surprised to return to the castle and find it in ruin. There are lots of enemies to fight here, including some we haven't seen yet like the pufferfish, which have an ever-present issue with how they can whip the camera around while you're locked onto them, even after some patches have tried to fix this. Despite this, I find this level to be quite a lot easier than the caves before, since you have more room to maneuver and a checkpoint in the middle of the castle. You can see that all the peaceful crabs have been executed in the same way that Nephro did to those alleged lawbreakers earlier. You need to scale the side of the castle to get inside, where you can open up the front door as an easy shortcut. You then proceed to the throne room to confront the Duchess.
Hey, I don't know if you noticed, but your guards are going nuts out there.
Oh, Clontre, little hermit. Our minds are clear as crystal now.
Oh, shuck.
I once thought my duchy quite beautiful, you know, worth preserving. But compared to the reefs, it's a shameful, transient thing, destined to wash away. That's why I'm having them tear it down. I thought my beauty worth preserving too. But of course, my worthless life will wash away as easily as any other. Almost as easily as yours, little hermit!
Magista, Tyrant of Slacktide, is our next boss fight, and given her name, she's likely based on a Dungeness crab, Metacarcinus Magister. Actually, scratch that, the description for Royal Wave confirms this. For a tutorial boss, she's actually quite difficult, although not nearly as cheap as the last one we just looked at. She attacks with a ball and chain type of object that I originally thought was a very small crab trap, but apparently it's a T-steeper. Yeah, I never said I was smart. She will occasionally throw up a substance called gunk, which you could have seen earlier on the way to the caves where we got the pearl. Touching this will begin to fill a meter that, once full, applies a slow poison type debuff called gunked. This slowly drains your health and nerfs your dodge to the speed of wearing a large shell or using the Drunken Claw shell spell. I've heard some people say that they've had almost the entire arena covered in this stuff due to Magista spamming this ability, but I've personally never seen it myself. I've enjoyed this fight every time I've done it. Whether I was focusing on dodges or parries, it was always a good time to weave between her attacks and respond accordingly, which makes this the perfect tutorial boss in my mind.
Your death will be gorgeous!
Once she's defeated, you unlock the Royal Wave, not Claw, ability, and see that the shark from before was hiding the entire time. He refuses to give your shell back, saying that he's going to sell it in New Carcinia, and you'll have to head there if you want to get it back, so that's our next destination. I really like the tutorial zone in this game. It's a perfect microcosm of the rest of the game, featuring 4 bosses, one of which is optional, 2 linear levels, and a decently sized open area to explore, loot, and earn enough microplastics to gain a few levels. It feels very well paced, with the story acting as the driving force to gently guide you through these systems without making it seem like you're on rails, like this is some obligatory sequence you need to rush through before you can actually start playing the game. At the same time, it doesn't overpromise on an experience that it never delivers, making it the perfect appetizer for what's to come.